Welcome, everybody. It's Andrew Shapiro from Broadscale Group. Delighted to be here today with a truly outstanding group of speakers for this session on the state of the energy transition. And it really couldn't be more timely or topical, and we are really delighted to have such an outstanding group who I will introduce in a moment. I want to just start by thanking our good friends at Our Energy Policy. OEP, as it's commonly known, is a leading nonpartisan, nonprofit think tank and research organization which convenes dialogues among leaders in the energy sector to try to forge consensus. And we're really delighted that they've partnered with us today in promoting this great session that we have with three experts in the space. I'm going to start by quickly introducing the moderator of today's discussion, Amy Myers Jaffe. Amy is a research professor and managing director of the Climate Policy Lab at the Fletcher School at Tufts University. She previously was the David Rubenstein Senior Fellow for Energy and the Environment and Director of the Program on Energy Security and Climate Change at the Council on Foreign Relations. And prior to that, she's held several senior roles as an expert in global energy policy and sustainability, including work with the Chief Investment Officer at the UC Regents, which is quite interesting as some of the dialogue we're going to have here. She's the author of the book, Energy's Digital Future, Harnessing Innovation for American Resilience and National Security as well, which we commend to you and look forward at some point to giving out to our network members. Next, I'm going to go to Chad Holliday. Chad, I met, I'll give a little personal twist to this one. I think it was about 15 years ago, Chad, when you were the CEO of DuPont, and my then firm Green Order did some work for DuPont, and it was a true honor to work with Chad because even back then, he was one of the clear acknowledged leaders in the corporate sector on moving us in a more sustainable direction in the work he was doing at DuPont. He then became the chairman of Bank of America, and then most recently was the chairman of Shell, Royal Dutch Shell, the global energy major, and just stepped down from that role, I think just over a month ago. He's held several leadership positions in the nonprofit and policy world, and too many to name, but I'll just mention one that I know he's very focused on now. He's the co-chairman of Mission Possible, which is a new effort led by the World Economic Forum and other not-for-profit organizations to focus on carbon abatement in the most difficult sectors to achieve that. So Chad, we're really delighted to have you with us today. And then my close friend, Andy Karsner, space cowboy, senior strategist at Alphabet X, the Moonshot Factory, longtime gadfly in the energy world, former Assistant Secretary of Energy for Efficiency and Renewables, Director of Applied Materials for many years. And most recently, as many of you know, he has been elected to the board of directors of Exxon as part of an activist slate of candidates who are going to be seeking to achieve unique things there that we'll inevitably get to. With that introduction, let me turn it over to Amy to lead our dialogue. For all of you who are joining us remotely, we welcome your questions. You can put them in the Q&A section, and I will try toward the end to help Amy facilitate those questions, but we're going to start out with the dialogue that Amy is going to kick off right now. Thanks.
Well, thanks so much, Andrew, and it's great to be here. Couldn't come up with two better panelists to give us a perspective on the energy transition. Both gentlemen have had multiple vantage points to think about this issue. So I'm looking forward to our conversation today. And just to level set, so we're all on the same page, we all know the energy transition's been in the news. It was really in the news in regards to large institutional investors and the courts in the last couple of weeks. But I think we need to begin our conversation with some definitional conversation. So, you know, how do you think about the energy transition? And I think most importantly, because there does seem to be some difference of opinion about this, has it already begun? Chad, why don't you go first?
Oh, thanks, Amy. It's a great pleasure to be with you. The energy transition is a structural change in the energy system to me. Yes, this one's already begun, that we've had at least 5 in the past, so it's not a new thing. So I look back at the ones that have gone in the past, they tend to take closer to a century than a decade. So it takes a long time for it to happen. They're usually characterized by a different fuel source, but the real driver is it does something different for people. So the different fuel source allows people to do more of the energy system, or it's a lower cost, or it's more convenient, or whatever. So yeah, I think in this transition, we need to be looking at what's worked in the past. We have to have something people want to adapt. So I don't think any ruler of the world has demanded people move to a system they don't like as well. We just got to make sure they understand what are the characteristics of the new system and why it's important. Obviously, the new system is going to be less fossil fuel and more renewables.
Andy, how about your own perspective?
I always learn so much from you and Chad when we're together. So I'm tended more to listen than to talk about things in your presence. But I guess I totally agree with what Chad characterized it as. In my own personal way of thinking about it, I don't think of it as an engineering or technical transition. I think of it as something that parallels the evolution of the human condition. You know, for me, there is no sort of, this is the phase of energy transition. It's almost a permanent continuum in the quest for humanity to harness biology, chemistry, and physics for some useful application as a tool for its advancement. And as we learn more about whether things are benign or toxic to us, we have different cost benefits analysis. And so those tools advance and fits and starts along the way of a continuum. This one seems more acute in the sense that we now have more awareness and more knowledge of the toxicity that we're contributing to either the atmosphere or our personal health or our communities. And there's a substantial momentum and investment in acceleration and in scale because of the scales of the systems that we've put in place. But, you know, Amy, you could argue that moving from whale oil to kerosene was an energy transition. I would. And so we continue on that path. And for me, it's really about, does our species have the way to organize and design systems that benefit us more than harm us? And do we have the tools in place to do that? I think the answer is yes. That's what Chad's worked on all his career and continues to work on now in various circles. And I think, you know, most of us who believe in the tool set are trying to make it all cost effective to win. So I would say it's always going on, but it's got to be accelerated and inflected with more purposeful design.
Well, let's talk about that for a second, Andy. I mean, you know, as you know, you've read my book. You know, I believe that there's some technologies that were coming anyway, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know, part of digitization, not really a, you know, there's some green activists out there pushing something on a law in Europe or in the United States or elsewhere. So what do you think? I mean, are we going to those technologies anyway because they build resistance or because they're cheaper or because maybe some of these large scale centralized projects are really leaving out so many people who are desperate and will be increasingly desperate for energy, whether that's for cooling or shelter, right? Or water, or do you think that these technologies that are developing, are they coming about because of government action?
You know, I'm a romantic patriot at heart. So for me, I believe in sort of residual American dreams, and I believe in axioms like nothing is as powerful in the universe as a good idea whose time has come. So we have plenty of good ideas that have effectuated tools that work, that were scoffed at when Chad was leading DuPont and people were scoffing at his effort to push us into non-edible biofuel sources. You know, those things sort of work, but then they have to work in a competitive landscape of other things that are emerging very fast. As you pointed out, you know, in those days, you know, we didn't even have an iPhone in 2007. Right. And now we have the largest company in the world that is the producer of the iPhone. So inevitably the shifts in capital, the shifts in technological investment mean we're not into single stream thinking, like a bunch of guys in white lab coats are going to break an atom, and that's going to be the new energy transition. It's going to come from 1,000 different places of innovation. And my view is that that innovation is a stream that always finds the river. The question is, have we put in too many dams? Have we entrenched the natural flow of technologies to find their inflection with incumbent systems that are deleterious to society? So we have to do as much unkinking of the garden hose as putting more pressure through the garden hose to make sure that we've got the flow, that these good ideas, these technologies, these investments are scaling at a rate commensurate with the demand pull. And so to me, there's more of a design of policy incumbent problem than there is an availability of technology problem.
So Chad, let me ask you that, because in your opening statement, you know, you're talking about the sort of standard thing I hear a lot from energy leaders, which is that these transitions take time and it takes time to scale. And, you know, Andy's basically saying, listen, we got the technologies there. We need incumbents to get out of the way. Well, he didn't quite say it that way, but I'm saying it that way.
Thanks for clarifying.
Yeah, no, I'm not putting those words in your mouth. I'm just going to throw those words out there.
Right.
You know, Chad, how do you respond to that?
Well, I wouldn't see the incumbents that are supplying the energy that's lighting your room today as the enemy. Yeah, I would say we need to pull together and find a good solution. So I think the more you think about existing suppliers of things we use every day and need for our health and well-being as an enemy is not a meaningful mindset. But I'd like to build on one thing Andy said that really hit me from my time back at DuPont when we were phasing out of CFCs. And we decided we were going to do that in 5 years. Now, no rational person would say you could eliminate CFCs, find the replacements, have capacity for everything in less than 5 years. And everybody said that was absolutely impossible. But once the industry started to work together, and one of the biggest steps we made was we decided to license royalty-free all of our technology to everybody else who was in the battle to get there. And that broke down barriers significantly. The Montreal Protocol, governments come together and putting some regulation behind it. All that happened in less than 5 years. That's fantastic. So if we think about industry being the enemy and we just got to shoot them, they probably won't work to it. So I think there's a real win-win here. And I think that's an example, much simpler, but we could learn from it.
Yeah, let me build on that, Amy, because Chad's exactly right. And I don't want to be misunderstood because there's a delicacy of the point in how we use the language. You know, I was taught very early when I was a new parent that there are no bad children. There are only bad behaviors. Okay. And so when I think of incumbents, I think of habits. I think of traditions. I think of doing things the way they were because it's the way we inherited it. I don't actually think of the organizations or the people of those organizations in particular that have the relevant acumen and skills and necessary engineering expertise and scientific acumen to be the purveyors of the solution. You know, so there Chad's exactly right. There are no villains. There are no enemies. It's foolish to look at some of our greatest companies and institutions as if they're all wearing black hats and everybody possessing the new technologies wearing white hats. That's really not the way the world works if what you want is to diffuse these technologies at scale in a time frame that matters. But it also means we've got to learn to dance in different ways than the ways that maybe we entered the workforce when we were 22 years old 35 years ago. And that's a tougher deal because people have been working on different solutions in different ways and have different patterns. And what's necessary isn't you're knocking out an incumbent player and displacing it. What's necessary is the integration of agile adaptivity, you know, in an environment that is moving very fast. And so I really like what Chad said about the Montreal Protocol lessons, because I think that is very apropos and a very great analogy. And just the idea of just the humane, intelligent idea of acceleration through royalty-free licensing that opens up this peripheral vision and new era of collaboration is demonstrable of kind of what we need in greater coalescence and to bring people out of silos.
So let's think about like today's world as opposed to the world where Chad, the time when Chad was so successful with the Montreal Protocol as a backdrop. You know, we're in this sort of COVID / post-COVID period, depending on, you know, what your worldview is. And then, you know, there have been debate, you know, is COVID accelerating the transition, or is COVID negatively altering the trajectory, right? And, you know, one big study came out today from Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia. I was one of the 5 authors. And one of the things that was discussed over the course of this study, which was a scenarios exercise, was that we can now see just how deep government can intervene in daily behavior, you know, in the modern age. I mean, there were people who didn't feel that, or maybe they thought that was only a certain kind of government or not a kind of government. But I think a lot of paradigms have been changed in terms of people's view of the role of government. And we now have more information. Where is it easy for the government to intervene in markets? Where is it hard? What do you think the upshot of all this is going to be? I mean, do we learn something from the rollout of vaccines in different places? Or is there no lesson there for the energy transition?
I mean, just my view is there's a lot we can learn from that. It's been a tremendous accomplishment. It was also because a lot of great scientific work has been done over decades, and then we had it at the time we needed it. So, but I don't think we can model the energy transition exactly like that. Even though the impact to human beings of climate change has potential to be much, much greater than COVID-19. It's not in our face as much. And so the communication process that's necessary to get out to people is just different. But I think we can certainly learn from it. And I think it should be encouraging to us in the long run. And particularly, we made a lot of mistakes in this COVID-19. We did so many things right, you know, and we could certainly handle another pandemic much better than we handled this one. But we're going to have to work hard to learn from it. We shouldn't copy it exactly. I think that would be at our peril.
Well, all wise commentary. Amy, again, I'm a bit of Chad is such an educated man and has science technology background. I kind of right away go to sort of storytelling, and I think of 2 great events in my lifetime have completely united the world. The capacity for when I was early a toddler to see the planet from outer space and photograph it and see that we were one whole planet. And, people born today don't even think of that. They've got Google images. They're at the center of every map, but the monumental breakthrough to go to another celestial body and take a photograph of the whole Earth without political jurisdictions was just an incredible mind shift for our planet. And here's COVID-19, the very first universal harm that everybody on the planet experienced at the same time, unless you were lucky enough to be on one of the islands of New Zealand and, whipped it really quick and so forth, and so there was, you couldn't have a better test barometer of how will we handle ultimate harm than one that is life-threatening personally to family and kin. And so there's a lot of good lessons, like, yes, if we lean in, we can almost miraculously devise an antidote or a vaccine in an unprecedented way without much of a roadmap, just by exerting ourselves with fullest concentration, as Chad's saying, rightfully built on decades of science, right? But the acute sort of white blood cell effect is just phenomenal. That 24 months out, we have a multiple vaccines to distribute. The converse of that is we have a population with an underinvestment in education that stubbornly, resistantly, maybe up to a third, don't want it. Think it might bring them harm, are stuck in social media mythologies about why it's not a good thing, imperiling the rest of us because we're in a race between vaccines and variants that is likely to continue for a very, very long time. So there's a analog and a lesson about bringing people along inclusively and depoliticizing matters of science in the collective best interest of the outcomes you seek. particularly when it's harder than something that's in your face and at your kitchen table and life-threatening in the immediate moment. So there was a great gauge on what needs to be done, both in terms of the government's effectiveness in purveying and creating tools, or the rules that enable the market to purvey those tools, and in the government's necessity of leading in such a way that you inclusively and without politics, to the degree that's possible, bring people along. On the whole, and in a net sum, sort of the arguments of telecommuting versus are we going back to road traffic and all of that, there's kind of a wait and see. There's a wait and see for realtors across Manhattan and London. There's a wait and see for people who sell cars after we're over this inflationary bump from supply chain snags over the last few years. But I think on the whole, there should be a greater conscientiousness. I just speaking for myself, who's a million frequent miler on multiple airlines over multiple decades, I've been pretty happy hanging out at home with my family. I've been pretty happy not being on an airplane as much. And I'm just wondering how many other people are thinking that way. So I think inevitably there's an impact on energy, and I think we're going to need to measure it over the next 2 and 4 and 5 years.
So I have an interesting question that I was going to ask you anyway, but I see in the chat somebody's talking about the question of creative destruction. Like, is that going to be necessary? So let's start with the large firms, right? In a world where you've mentioned the iPhone, and you and I could talk about 100 different inventions like that. We got 3D printing coming down the road. We have automation is really going to kick in a really strong fashion, in the next decade. So when we think about creative destruction, for large firms, should they be acquiring entrepreneurial companies? Can they incubate a new business internally? Chad, you've been looking at that puzzle for 2 decades. What's your view on that?
Yeah, well, it's a real challenge. But if I was going to give Andy some advice on this new board he just joined,
I'll take it.
You need to help them do what they can do well. Okay, to force them into doing things they don't have the natural capability to do. It's a great company. They can do wonderful things. You need to help them focus on that. And I think that's the message. So if you're trying to focus any company on doing something that will not be it's not naturally. It's not the point. So I do get very concerned that a lot of groups with great interest are trying to force oil and gas companies to become something they're not. And each oil and gas company is very different. So what one can do, another one can't do. I think it's very important. I'd like to make one observation, which is a little bit off your question, but perhaps people on this call, if they're in the U.S., have seen the new ads for the new F-150 Ford pickup truck that's all electric. Now, I don't have any inside knowledge into that. I don't have a relationship with Ford in this area, but I look at what they've done. They have not talked about climate change in their ads. They have brought features to the owner that they like. And that's now I can plug in my electrical equipment into my truck. That truck can back up the power to my house, and it'll also accelerate twice as fast as my current truck. And everybody needs to accelerate twice as fast, right? So those are the factors that are getting people to buy electric pickup trucks. I think it's very important, this whole subject. We need to give the consumer, the customer we got, what's important to them and stress those features. And I think that would be very important in this whole effort.
So Andy, let me pivot that to you, because you have a big company experience but from a very different place. First chapter in my book, I describe your and my journey out in California, where I found once I got out to the West Coast that people in the West Coast had no idea what the innovation that was happening in the shale patch. They just thought of it as being some incumbent industry using 50-year-old technology. And then when I would go back to Houston, I had so much difficulty convincing people, that there were real innovation coming in storage and in digital and automation, and even how people use data. And in the end, you and I, being the way we are, we wound up having some, retreat out in Napa Valley where we made everybody sit in the same room. And as I describe it in the book, it was like 2 meteors colliding, and neither one could go back on the trajectory they were on before. So given what Chad's saying about, companies following their own culture, and, we're talking about, when we talk about the energy industry or the tech industry, we're talking about, companies of engineers and science people and, some business finance people, but, you have a lot of technical people in these companies on both sides, right? So how do you see, firms like your own firm, Alphabet or Microsoft, Apple, Amazon, like, where are they going to fit in the energy transition? And what does that mean for big companies that are, sort of lumbering energy giants?
Well, it's a great question. It's a great setup. I would say that, I've said before, so it's not new, and it's not even new to me, unique to me, that, what oil was in the 20th century, data is in the 21st, which is the driver of all value and growth. And that, there's a reason why, these companies, the FANG companies, have overwhelmed market share of capital on capital markets, and the industrials have shrunk in the case of some companies being delisted from the Dow, et cetera. And that reason is that, ultimately these companies, whatever their intrinsic advantages, whatever their market positions, are aggregations of capital, and whether that's human capital and talent, or physical capital and stock, or whether it's actual financial capital. They are aggregators of capital, and what they do with it to problem solve with some value is ultimately what determines their market. And in the case of the FANG companies, not speaking for Alphabet, to be clear, but just a personal opinion, I think you have much more agile capital, because data is a very lightweight commodity. It's very mobile, it's very fast, it's very fast in its evolution. A generation of artificial intelligence a decade ago is unrecognizable to what is happening with AI today. Even though Moore's law is decelerating, someone could argue even stopping, the new evolutions in the architecture of hardware and semiconductors is driving new revolutions in machine learning and encryption, and whole industries are being wildly shifted. So I think that means that the data economy, if you will, cuts across all economies. That there was a time 10 or 15 years ago where there was this sector and the tech sector. I think all sectors are tech sectors. If you don't view yourself as a tech company, no matter what sector you're in, I think it's probable that you are handicapping your prospects and probabilities. So I lay that out sort of first. Secondly, I'd say that Chad is right, that there is real benefit in sticking to the knitting in this idea of organic versus inorganic growth. I think you have to do both. I think the world moves too fast and change occurs at such a pace that the best companies, I was just on a rafting trip with the CEO of Walmart for the last 2 days, and we were talking about, how do they handle their data? Right. And so the best companies, here's an old line company with Sam Walton, if you can picture him going Oldsmobile town to town, creating these big real estate warehouses full of goods. And he's competing with Amazon, that has a light footprint. It's just now putting little airport kiosks for Echoes and everything else, but has a massive capacity. So these two titans are up against each other. Thank God, because that's what kept us tethered and fed during this pandemic. And you have to do both. You have to be committed to an innovation culture within that does what Chad says, make the thing that you're good at, the core, as strong or stronger than anyone else out there. But understand the adjacencies and the disruptors, and not have the conceit. Instead, embrace the humility of saying there are going to be things beyond the borders of this wall, this brand, this franchise that I need to know, need to have, need to interact with in some shape, form, or fashion. And so I think you need both. I don't think it's one or the other. I think it's strengthen the core, always be aware of the adjacency, and always deal with the humility of being a learning organization, whether it's generated from inside or without. And then finally, just to put a point on it and take it back to your book and some of the exercise we were involved in not ironically, somebody who Chad trained through the years and became his successor, Ellen, she's the CEO of one of our portfolio companies, Carbon 3D, the very place I took you and the Council of Foreign Relations people. So here's a CEO of of DuPont, one of the most venerable R&D organizations, one of the leaders in biology and chemistry. And here's Ellen, coming to the West Coast for a startup that she believes in, and who she recruit? Alan Mulally, the CEO from Ford. So here's a startup enterprise with a world-class board that use decades of experience and corporate management to say this agile disruptive technology is so transformative. How do we scale it faster? So I think at the end of that story is cross-fertilization of DNA, learning organizations that embrace innovation, whether they are generative internally or agile and embracing it externally as adjacencies, are going to be the winners. Those that are convince themselves that their fortified positions are by tradition or entitlement going to lead forever are headed down the Eastman Kodak route of reductive enterprise.
So,
if I could just jump in, Amy, I wanted to add one point to that, because many of our audience members are part of Broadscale's corporate network, which includes companies including Shell and Equinor. And one of the interesting things we've seen, to the point that Chad and Andy were just discussing, is that sometimes the both and works when you take the skill set, that core skill set that Chad was talking about, but figure out ways to apply it in new contexts, right? So the fact that Equinor was an offshore oil and gas exploring company, but has now become a leading player in offshore wind, makes a lot of sense. The fact that Shell, not only is upstream, but is downstream and has retail, makes sense that they've done a lot in EV charging. They've made 3 acquisitions in EV charging, right? Because they know how to deal with the retail customer. So that's maybe another element to add in, just to amplify what both of you were saying.
well, and let's take it back, because I remember somebody I think made an allusion to the World Economic Forum because of Chad's current position. Back in 2015, I was on a panel, actually I was chairing a panel on the future of oil and gas. And we had to break out into 2 working groups because some people were really convinced that the business as usual wasn't going to change. And the other half wanted to work on, what would it mean if oil demand started to go down, certainly in the OECD, but what if that became the global trend? What are companies really positioned? And there were some people from what's now Equinor, on that panel. And at the start of the panel, they probably were a little skeptical. By the end of the panel, they had gone through their own exercise, kind of TCFD, Task Force on Climate Change Disclosure process of testing their business against different scenarios. And in the end, that did lead them to pivot to offshore wind. And so, there is this exercise that, on the one hand, I've got some legacy assets and they're going to pay out for me. So what do I do with them? But part of what you have as an organization is not just your access to capital, but your access to intellectual enterprise. And how are you going to mobilize that amazing team that's been put together to respond to a changed environment? And I noticed when I watched the investment community, I was on a panel the Wall Street Journal put together, and since they didn't put this quotation in the paper, I won't say who are some of the people on the call, but there was some debate about where people would put their money, right? What kind of industries would people put their money in? And one of the people on the call was a CIO of a big institutional investor. And he basically said that if he has a choice between Apple and company B, why wouldn't he pick Apple? Because he's betting on technology innovation. And he was adamant that that's where he thought the future was going to be. And so if you look at a company like Tesla, is it really, are you really investing in electric cars and your view of that market? Or are you impressed by the fact that Tesla has a filter technology that protects you in your vehicle during a pandemic or during a bioterrorism attack? Are you interested in the technology because their battery system has a cooling system that's not tied to an external generator, right? And maybe that's going to be important in a heat wave, right? So, they have certain kinds of innovations and they have certain business model to get to those innovations that go beyond the core product. Were they innovative in the way they are producing the car, right? So I think when I look out over the energy industry, and Chad mentioned Equinor, right? I even think about, I like to give the investment community doesn't seem to be giving them the credit, but I like to give BP the credit for trying to think about how to integrate their legacy assets with a path forward, which they say is not designed about, did they buy into some deal at this number or that number? They say their vision is how to scale, and that, companies of their size are well positioned to scale. How do you respond to that, Chad?
Yeah, so let me just give you an example. Shell 4 years ago took the entire board and management team for a full day at Google, for 3 days in the Valley, talking to entrepreneurs, looking at some of our investments and others, 1 day at one of the national labs to understand. And what we were searching for there is what could we uniquely do and where do we need to partner with these other companies? We could not beat them in some areas. And yet, as we heard Google present their energy strategy, we could help them a lot. So from that, under Ben Van Beurden's leadership, there's now a sector by sector strategy to try to help each sector all the way through the value chain accomplish what it wants to do. And so it's going to be critical for the Googles and the Microsofts and the Apples to partner with those individual sectors as they're making the move. By the way, that ties a lot back to the more hard to abate sectors. Yeah, most people don't understand that 30% of the greenhouse gases come from these hard to abate sectors. So if we decide we're just going to work on those because they're too hard, we're not going to get there because the rest can't pick up the load. But if we take these tech companies together with existing suppliers and others and a little bit of real creativity and some hard science, we can make a difference. That's what this Mission Possible partnership is all about. So I think the answer to your original question is we need to utilize them in multiple ways. And that's why the existing energy suppliers need to partner over and over again with these companies.
So let's pivot on that specific question. So when you and Andy, both of you, look across the energy space, are there lessons we can learn for who's dominating in new areas, who's dominating in renewables or energy grid management, EVs, hydrogen? Like, what can we learn from who's dominating in those spaces today?
Andy, go ahead.
Well, there's too many lessons to learn, and I'm not sure any one party learns them all. I think you've got to draw the ones that are specific to the problem you're trying to solve in the domain in which you dwell. But there's there's not, as I said, the chief attribute is learning. So of course there are lessons to learn. The question is, how do you not waste time and have a methodical plan to profit from performance? At the end of the day, I also sort of applaud BP's intention. I certainly applaud, Chad's leadership in putting out net zero 2050 strategy and plans, for the shareholders, and that's leadership and vision and setting a North Star on the horizon. But at the end of the day, performance and results is what matters in capital markets, and so that's got to manifest itself somehow. And then companies are rated different ways, right? A tech company can have multiple times more patience on a higher PE multiple than a commodity-driven company, where there's an expectation of how much volume are you delivering at what value, right? And so I just sort of made the point that, well, everybody's got to be a tech company So how are we scoring the way we think of performance and value in the integration of technological advance and innovation into a strategy? How much patience do people have? People ran out of a lot of patience with GE, which is historically one of the greatest corporate labs, but they started sort of dinging them for putting too much patience without enough conversion and capitalization on the innovation that was organically coming out of the labs. So the lessons are all around, and they're not always positive. Right? You want to choose the positive ones, and then you want to say, what are my skill sets? What do I have the capability of integrating or adapting to? That's how Apple went from PC to mobile. It wasn't necessarily, it was an endemic skill set. Anybody who remembers the Newton would know that Apple would not sort of claim the flag of having an intrinsic skill set in mobile. Okay, but they did do exactly what Chad's saying, devised a better design, a better mousetrap, a breakthrough disruptive innovation that turned Motorola's lead on its head, that shifted the way we thought about mobile. Right. And so, but let's also be clear, not all of that happened inside of Apple. Some of it happened in adjacencies over time, around Silicon Valley. I think those analogs are clear. I think they're it's clear when you look at Fisker. It's clear when you look at Tesla. Could you say that GM has learned a thing or two between the original Volt in 2006 and coming out with an F-150 that is closer to an iPhone mentality than let's devise something for green people to park more conveniently at airports? Absolutely. That is a revolution shift. And these things take time. They take iterations. The lessons don't come with a big, voila moment or a big epiphany. Quite often they come through 2 and 3 iterations on these things. The last thing I'll say about it is generally the rule in Silicon Valley, which I think is probably fitting across all, not all, some, but not all industries, is that, you think kind of in threes. You think of like, who's the leader? Who's the fast follower or challenger? You're sort of Coke and Pepsi, and who is, and I won't say which is which. You can blind taste test that yourself. And who is sort of the dark horse? Who might have just enough works, between the Hertz and Avis and becomes the thrifty, right? And beyond that, there's a shakeout of lots of others, okay? So finding out and understanding the dynamic in any particular sector or industry of what kind of defining leadership makes an enterprise gain the most market share or hold the most market share, who has the most competitive strategy for penetration. So we're seeing this across cloud services today. We're seeing this across, semiconductor production. I think you're going to see it as well in the consolidation and excellence of performance and results of the purveyors of increasingly clean technologies, whether that's rolling stock, like, Ford and GM are announcing that they intend to go, or whether it's new fuel sources or new deliveries of electrons or new chemistries for battery storage. I think all of these things are going to follow these rules, and you've got to have agile incorporation of lessons learned and be very open to the idea that there's learnings across the whole spectrum.
So let's talk about where the market's seeing these different companies. Chad mentioned Equinor, but, one could, of course, mention Ørsted, as the new darling, right? And when you look at, where that company's trading times its revenues, we're talking double digits, right? Whereas for the, incumbent companies that we haven't made a pivot or are pivoting slowly, we're talking about, 2 times revenue, 3 times revenue, 4 times revenue. Do institutional investors have it wrong? What would be your advice to institutional investors on how to think about this issue?
That's a pretty complex company because, when you can get down to an Ørsted where you're just a one-cylinder company, it's a much clearer investment. So, and it's probably a whole different discussion whether the investment community is right. I'd like to go back to your original question. Yeah, it's the companies that can know their customers. I think if I was looking for one characteristic, how well do they know their customers? What are their customers asking for? And what do their customers really need? They may not be asking for the right thing. So I go back to my time at Bank of America, and under Brian's leadership, we were focused on our less income customers because we didn't make much money on them. And so we decided to go into their homes to try to understand what they're doing. And so we found the people that were managing much better at low income had some certain techniques. One of the techniques that I'll never forget is when they get a little cash ahead, they freeze it literally in their freezer. They generally freeze it around green peas for some reason, because they don't want to have that instant buy, or that impulse buy. They don't want their kids to have the impulse buy. You have to wait for the money to thaw out before you can go spend it. Here at the bank, we were working on how do we give them speed so they can spend their money really quick. It was just the opposite of what's been shown. But it was only by going in the homes and understanding that you could start shaping the right kind of offerings for that people. I think the companies that are doing that, I don't care what they have as their fuel source today, will probably be a piece of the winners going forward.
So that leads me to my favorite question on my list of questions. And then I'm going to really dedicate myself to the questions in the chat. So if you're listening here, please gear up some more questions for us. Number one thing, pick one. What do you think is the latest or most overlooked area of the energy transition that you're most optimistic or excited about?
Hydrogen.
Andy, do you agree?
Well, most is the operative word there. I would say storage.
Okay, now that's an interesting distinction, which is I'm going to split the hair. I mean, hydrogen is a storage technology, right? So let's break that down a little bit. Chad, you're interested in hydrogen. Of course, you're doing Mission Impossible. So hydrogen's a big solution out there for heavy industry.
Mission Possible.
Mission Possible.
Yeah.
Right. So thinking about my movie, my movie viewing. But on the other hand, we have like different kinds of storage. One of you mentioned the idea that I could take my Ford 150 pickup truck, and if I was in Texas and things were going badly and I had the right engineer with my house and a solar panel, I might be able to rig it up so that my car could be a integrative part of my islanding myself off the grid if it's not working properly. So, how are we thinking about that? Is it because when I look out over the sector, I see some companies betting heavily on hydrogen. I see other companies betting heavily on batteries. And I don't see anybody, frankly, having too constructive a comment on what happened in Texas or the new heat wave and why their product's going to solve it. So what do you think?
Well, your F-150, I wasn't in the heat wave. I will be next week, but I was in the freeze and, looking after a 91-year-old father with no heat and horrified, in the home I grew up in the most energy rich state in our country, that this was happening. And an F-150 plug-in at that time would have been less about islanding than useful backup dispatchable power. And so look, anything that makes the customer, the citizen, the taxpayer, which happens to be all the same person, anything that makes our life better, more convenient, higher quality, less corrosive, more healthy, more thriving, and it's cost effective, accessible, and affordable, is where everything ought to be going. So I'm for any entrepreneur choosing their favorite, pursue. It's not hydrogen or storage or sequestration. It's let 1,000 flowers bloom with American entrepreneurship and innovation and persistence that, necessity is the mother of invention, and we will build better mousetraps. So you said most, so I chose storage because Chad landed on hydrogen. I want them all to win. I'm not for a particular technology. I am for a particular outcome, which is the elevation of the human condition, which is the strength of American communities, which is the health of our habitats. So designing for the attributes and enabling technologies to achieve those attributes And when I say overcome or overwhelm incumbency, I'm not even talking about necessarily oil and gas. I'm talking about toxicity. I'm talking about benzene and tellurine. I'm talking about criteria air pollutants. I'm talking about greenhouse gas emissions. There are things we can design away from just as we design towards something else. And you know, Amy, better than anybody, that it's all a system. And a system requires multiple parts, right? And our system needs many nodes of improvement. So whether it's protons or electrons as a storage medium, whether it is lithium ion or lithium air or something devoid of lithium, the key is, are we achieving equitable accessibility and affordability for our populations fast enough with the characteristics we seek?
So I'm just going to throw out a real speedball here from, I have a great comment from Paresh Patel, and I'm going to twist it slightly to stay on theme because we only have a few minutes left. He says, his question is, what role do you see for consumers to compensate for their own Scope 3 emissions? I'm going to change that question slightly with Patel's lack of permission, but we're hoping for his permission, which is, we're the consumers out there. You get a lot of unhappy consumers in Texas. What should consumers be looking for? What should they be doing when they think both Scope 3 and just resilience?
And can I actually amend Amy's question with another one, since it might be the last for each of you before we move towards wrapping? Couple that with, there was another question about consumers' lack of trust in government. And we know that government, we just had Senator Ed Markey on. Obviously, we're all following the play-by-play every day on the infrastructure bill and how much climate will be in the infrastructure bill or not with the bipartisan bill and the reconciliation process. So if you could each weave, your thoughts about, as Amy said, what can consumers do and what's the role of government, and that would be a terrific way to close things.
Maybe, Andrew, I could pick up just a shell example. In the Netherlands, starting about 2 years ago, we offer consumers the opportunity to offset their carbon emissions with another penny per liter at the pump. What we found in doing that is they wanted to understand how it was going to happen. So it was going to be a nature-based solution. We're going to plant trees. We felt it was important to plant the trees in the Netherlands. We wanted them to go out and look at the forest that they were helping build. We thought that was a part of the package. There has been good update on that, but it's not 100%, all right? But I think the more you can make that a friendly solution to the customer, where they can see it can make a difference and really knows it's making a difference, will help. And if the government can add, if they can add validity to it by their weighing in, I think that's a part of the win-win.
Yeah, Chad has a lot more experience on these practical solutions because he's been innovating so many of them. I think that the first step is to understand that there's no consumer really knows what Scope 3 is. That's for the wonky zone of the people who live in this discussion all the time. So you go out and tell somebody randomly, tell my sister in Burleson, Texas, I'd like you to pay more money at the pump for Scope 3. They'll say, what are you talking about? And now if you humanize it a bit and say, would you like more trees in your community? And there's somebody with the veracity and validation and capability to measure the oxygenation of those trees, the sequestration and carbon value of those trees, and you can bring that onto the balance sheet of decision making, which is, I hope, where we are going with nature-based solutions. In fact, I know that's where we're going. I hope that's where we're going faster. And then you have a business model. We're trying things right now. Right. There is a trial and error piece of this right now where you've got to educate, include, and bring people along in the problem solving, which is what Scope 3 is about, this consumer end state. But just assuming that upstream, the corporations know how to manage consumer behaviors at the point that you've turned over the product and they're converting it in a tailpipe of an old Hummer or something is kind of a disconnect between sort of the academic architecture of what Scope 3 intends to achieve versus the reality of needing to build models to achieve it. So to Andrew's point about government, this takes everybody. It takes our corporate actors and the way that we've designed ourselves with aggregators of capital and human talent to direct themselves to solutions. It takes innovators and disruptors and entrepreneurs to be the jet skis around all of these flagship lords of the Admiralty and help guide them in a way with greater agility. And it takes government not working at odds with these things, but in fact, enabling them with intelligently architected rule sets that minimize the roles where government is inefficient and use the lightest touch for the maximum utilization of what the private sector brings. That harmony between having good governance, good corporate leadership, and a great community of creatives that can integrate and scale innovation, we haven't got to the right operating rhythm of that. I think that's what Chad's Mission Possible sort of attempts to do, is look at the whole landscape and say, this is possible. So I start with, Chad's a great, mentor to me. I mean, a role model. And I start with that kind of optimism. The worst thing you can do is say it can't be done. I do not see a path, and therefore I will not commence upon one. That is the worst thing to do. That is the opposite of moonshot thinking. So to begin with, we need to go to this place, and we may not know in totality how we get there, but if we all collectively bring our assets together, we can devise and figure it out. Government has a key and indispensable role of beating that drum and making sure it doesn't overwhelm the field of players that it collects, but instead is a trusted, objective third-party arbiter that acts as a catalyst and helps move that field forward.
Amy, if I could just build on what Andy said, because I think it was really powerful and the right balance. I'd urge the 75 people that are on this call right now, when you get through here, Google the grand challenges of engineering. There were 14 grand challenges of engineering that were posed in 2008. Make your own analysis of how grand they were in 2008, but I think they were pretty darn grand. And look at what's been accomplished. Make solar energy economical was one of those challenges. It's been done. Personalized learning, it's been done. Take virtual reality to a new level, it's been accomplished. And there's a few on there that haven't been accomplished. But the idea of really coming together, what are the grand challenges of the energy transition? Make sure they're balanced. They're not one company's view, but they're balanced. Get them out there, keep them to a small number. It was 14 because that's what they came up with. That made sense. I don't know what the number is here, but my guess is probably even less than 10. It would be necessary. Get them out there. The difference it could make if we were all aiming at those same targets could be tremendous. And that's a simple thing we could do before the end of this year in a very credible way.
Well, listen, we're basically out of time. I just want to thank you both for your perspectives. I leave you with this one last thought, in light of what Chad just said. In studying some of what's happening in other parts of the world, you're seeing places like the favelas of Brazil and other sectors in sub-Saharan Africa, where literally communities of people are organizing to put in solar because there's no other possibility for them at this time to have services. So, it really is kind of an interesting question, what comes from citizen action and what is the great potential of that if mobilized, and what is government's role to try to help people if they have an ambition. So at that, I just want to thank you both for a really pretty stimulating conversation. I hope it's left our listeners optimistic that there's some great leadership out there and interesting technologies to try to deploy. And we hope to continue this conversation in another forum.
Thank you, Amy.
I just want to add thanks to you, Amy. Great job facilitating this dialogue. And Andy and Chad, we couldn't be more grateful for your time today. Leaving on that note, we had a question in the chat there. Is there a secret ingredient that needs to be added to scale the energy transition? And I think we now know what it is. It's optimistic collaboration, that we can do this if we work well together. And I think that's a founding principle of what we've tried to do at broad scale with our corporate network and other investors that we work with. It's what OEP is all about, our energy policy, bringing folks together who may not agree on everything, but seeing where we can agree. And boy, if we could bring that spirit to the halls of our Congress, we would be in a whole different place. But we thank you all for your time, and thanks everyone for joining us. And our network will have a chance to debrief on this fantastic conversation when we assemble again tomorrow. But thank you all three of you and everyone for joining us today.
Thank you, Andrew. Thanks, Chad.